to the Critical Interference podcast here at CEMUS. CEMUS is the Center for Environment and Development Studies, a joint center at Uppsala University and the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. CEMUS has been working with student-led courses on climate, sustainability and other topics for over 30 years, but also with outreach and collaboration with local and international organizations, and also a research forum, CFO. We're doing this podcast to open up different conversations, different topics, and have those in a different format. So, with no further ado, we'll jump into today's episode. Thank you. Welcome to the Critical Interference podcast here at CEMUS, the Center for Environment and Development Studies. And with us today, we have Vivian Price, guest from California in the US, and also with us, Sophie Palmer, a student at CEMUS, who's helping us out now over the coming 3 weeks. So that's great to have you both here. You get to introduce yourself a bit more in these questions, and if you want to add things about yourself. And you get a longer question with Vivian, maybe a bit trickier and harder. But Sophie, do you want to introduce yourself briefly, who you are and what you've studied at CEMUS?
Yeah, perfect. So I'm actually not from Sweden. I'm an exchange student from Australia, and I was studying at CEMUS the past semester for 6 months. I did a course on climate change leadership in practice, which was an exploration, I guess, of what we can do and how we can put climate change leadership, in practice. So we were kind of left to do a project for 10 weeks, and we did a positive climate art gallery. And then back at Monash, at my home university in Melbourne, Australia, I study geographical science and then climate science as well. Yeah. That's
great. And Vivian, you're here for a screening of your documentary, Talking Union, Talking Climate, and that's this afternoon. But we also wanted to get this in-depth, more informal conversation with you. And you get to introduce yourself in this first question. And don't worry, it can be long, it can be shorter, it can be very personal, it can be more introductory. So basically the question we always start off with, what kind of things in life led you down this path of being involved in these issues, and I'm guessing being passionate about these issues and working with all of this, if you can pinpoint certain things in your life or share any story that kind of led you along this way.
Thank you for that question. Let's see. My parents were refugees from Hitler's Austria. So I grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust, feeling that the world was an unjust place, but also with the hope of having a good life in the United States. We were able to survive and make a new life. But I also found that I was raised during the era of a lot of political activism and a lot of political change in the 60s and 70s. I became interested in the civil rights movement, in the anti-Vietnam War movement, in the women's movement, in the lesbian and gay movement, started participating in demonstrations. Also, this was the time of the 1967 war in Israel. I also became more aware of the Israeli-Palestinian issues and conflicts. So it became a questioning of my own background and my own assumptions growing up. And I think that led me to finish university studying in history. I studied archaeology as in my bachelor's and history in my master's. And then I started working in factories and was involved in trying to organize unions and learning about what it's like to be a worker and finding out that you don't have the right freedom of speech when you're on an assembly line. You have to learn how to survive. And got more involved in union activities. I worked in electronics, in pharmaceuticals, in steel. And one of the reasons I worked in these many different places is because I got fired many times for speaking out, thinking that I had the right at a safety meeting to point something out about what was obvious, an obvious problem in the workplace. So and many of these were non-union places. The first union place I worked at was a steel mill, and there weren't many women. This was a time of affirmative action, was first started for women and people of color in the United States, and I got a job there working nights and was one of the few women there. There weren't bathrooms for women in the place that I was working at. I'd have to travel to a different area. And when I was, for one example of working at night was, and being fired was that we would work with these big galvanizing tanks where they dip the steel for transmission towers into these vats, and then they would be brought out, and we'd have to wait till we would work on the next batch. And while we waited in the cold, all the guys went into the men's bathroom where they had an anteroom and collected black widow spiders, put them in a bucket, and watched them fight. So, of course, I went along with it and, learning about working culture and getting out of the cold. And I was fired for being in the men's bathroom. And this was before I passed probation, so I had no union rights to fight for my job. Mm-hmm. I probably could have sued, but kind of difficult to do that. Mm-hmm. At any rate, I became an electrician. That was a way to get a skill that gave me more stability and more ability if I was fired, which I was fired from some of those jobs too, to go back to the hall and get dispatched to another job. And I really learned my skill, and I learned also how and when to speak up. I learned how to be active in my union. But I also saw a lot of problems on the job in terms of pollution and the way materials were handled and waste. And it grew my consciousness about contamination and again, environmental injustice. And then as things progressed, I went back to school because I got involved in filmmaking and wanted to develop that. But I also couldn't afford to really be a film student and think about making a living in that way. So I took my PhD in political science. And my wife of many years now, we've been together over 20 years, has always been involved in being concerned about climate and justice. And she really urged me to think about how to bring my interests in labor activism together with my climate research. And so that's sort of how the backstory of how this evolved.
Mm. And were your parents working class, their backgrounds as well? So that's how you...
My parents were not working class.
Oh, okay, yeah.
My parents were middle class in Vienna. My grandfather owned a shop on one side, and my father's parents had a factory. But when they came to the United States, they had nothing. So my father worked in a factory, and my mother worked as a clerk in a shop. And they hoped that I would become a professional and marry well and have children and those kinds of things. But they didn't have that activism, and they didn't have the working class consciousness. It was something really that developed out of the 60s and the era that I grew up in.
Mm. And also you lived in California your whole life, or was it other parts of the U.S. as well? I've traveled in the U.S., so that's why I'm curious as well.
Yeah. I was born in Ohio, we lived in North Carolina for a brief time. My parents had settled in Georgia when they came to the United States because it was during the Depression and they couldn't find work anywhere else. My mother was not a big fan of segregation or the way people were treated. So she really didn't want to go back to the South. And then we moved to New York, where it was also more of a Jewish population and where there were more opportunities for education and different kinds of employment. So I was raised there, went to college in Pennsylvania, then went to my master's in Texas, and then settled in California.
Yep. And you're also here for the Talking Union, Talking Climate documentary, and filmmaking as a different way of very different from academic writing, I'm guessing. What captured you with filmmaking and that kind of medium, and also working with interviews, I'm guessing, and also imagery, and there's more emotions in film than maybe academic writing,
right?
Sometimes, at least.
Yeah. I think this goes back to what Sophie alluded to in her introduction about the art gallery, the climate art gallery, using art and culture as a way to express political ideas and also emotions that you want to find voice for. And I was a writer as a young person. I really enjoyed writing poetry and short fiction. But again, that was not something that was encouraged because it really didn't lead to a career in my family's eyes. And so I moved away from that for a while, but I really had that creative interest. And I found in filmmaking, in the 70s, video was emerging. And I lived across the street from a museum for a while where they called it the Video Annex. And I went over there and I would, there were some artists that were working there who were really players in the art scene and the video scene, and they helped me start getting skills in doing video. And I was an electrician at the time. So there is a crossover between the electronics and understanding circuitry and the fascination with how a camera works, how to set up lights, etc., but also the creative process. And I also had a chance to get some classes in what they called public access TV, where you, for free, would be able to go to a TV station, cable TV station, and learn, take out the equipment for free, or even work on the trucks and go to sports events and play with the cameras. So and work in studios. So I loved all of that, and I started making short films myself. So that was the beginning of my interest in videography, and I saw its power to communicate, just as I had with writing. But what's wonderful about film is that it's not such a solitary practice, and working with other people is a wonderful thing. So I really grew to like that very much, and I started taking classes and became more professional in my work.
And it connects also to discussions we had before about emotions as part of education, and also the question, and it's very different, of course, for different people, but what kind of, if I think about myself, what are the moments or the kind of things in my life that I've faced or heard about or seen that have kind of changed me? And if I think about text, of course, there's certain books or maybe poetry, but what I think about are movies, and it's also documentaries. And documentaries and movies that kind of take you off guard or kind of surprise you in a way. And your kind of emotional response is also surprising. You don't know where all the emotions kind of flow into you. So I think that is also, there is a lesson here somehow in how education is not normally constructed in a way where emotions are part of it, or different mediums that communicates with emotions or a mix of emotions and other things. So
yeah, I feel like with film as well, there's something really special about being able to see another individual's eyes, and just, I guess, with documentaries, maybe not all films, you're really connecting with someone on a intimate, personal level if they're sharing very intimate details about their life, and they're sharing their stories. Yeah, it's a complete stranger that you still feel connected to, and I think that's like something very special. And in education, you cannot necessarily get that with a academic paper. Yeah. Or maybe if it's well written, I don't know, but for me personally, I guess.
Yes, I think it invokes other parts of your senses to get engaged with a visual text. And it's also more accessible. You know, the written word doesn't work for everybody, or the read word. So the visual is something that's much more, just as music too. There's so many different ways to access emotions and thoughts and ideas that we want to, especially if we're passionate about something like climate change or labor standards, labor conditions, or communities' well-being, that we want to be able to find different ways of communicating that do engage people's emotions and stimulate dialogue. And as a professor, in the past 20 years, I've been a professor at a university. Several different universities, but most recently for the last 17 at Cal State University, Dominguez Hills in Los Angeles, California. I've used media in my classes, both documentaries and film, and it's been really important to my students. And also, I've involved my students in making videos using digital storytelling, for example, which involves storytelling and then the use of either still or moving footage to make a short film. And then having reflections, maybe writing written reflections about it, sharing. And that's been pivotal to the way I teach.
A connected question also that I just wrote down and realized that both of you are part of or from parts of the world where climate change and the effects of climate change, both with forest fires and flooding and other things, have that been something that's been part of how you've kind of changed your relationship to whether climate change in a more abstract way or like the landscape nature around you? And has it also been something you felt have changed other people that you had conversations with or know from before?
I would say, yeah, most definitely. I think there's something you cannot really deny climate change when you're seeing a forest fire, or you're seeing the floods, or your family members are telling you about it. I think when you are able to experience something or physically touch it or physically see it, I think that's important, and maybe something in countries, I guess, like ours that are experiencing climate change in these really tangible and really real world impactful ways. I guess it'd be interesting to see the rates of like climate change denial in these countries, if they are different. Maybe in the US, would be a little bit different. But yeah, I think for me personally, there has definitely been people and maybe even family members in my life that are still, I guess, kind of conflicted or have different views. But I think for the wider community, maybe the acceptance is higher, and the willingness to act and the need for change, I guess, is probably also higher, I guess, in relation to that, because we have, I guess, such devastating floods and fires year after year. We were talking about it earlier as well. It's kind of just like a fire in the summer and then a small break and then a flood, like continuously every year. So yeah, definitely, I guess, helpful to see the tangible impacts in our countries. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of polarization in the United States, and denial and individual paths have been very much what characterizes many people's way of grappling with their environment. So in Los Angeles, we have, especially in where I've lived, I lived for 40 years in the South Bay, we have about 5 or 6 refineries. So there's a lot of pollution in the air. And that's normal. Sometimes there's what we call a giant oil fart that comes out of the oil islands that are disguised as exotic hotels in the water just off the shore. And something in passing. But, people have spoken out about it. There's fires in the refinery. There's destruction. So you live in these environments and it seems normal. It's something, these are the best paid jobs around. And especially in a region where there used to be a lot of good paying jobs, where there were auto plants and steel plants and tire plants, all of which were very polluting, but which paid well. And in a country where there's no universal health care, where education is expensive, where housing is expensive, and there's very little support for communities where schools are dependent on the taxes of that immediate community. It's hard to really raise questions about how you're living. However, the youth, I think, it's a different generation, and people are scared. And from my own memory as a young person and as a student, when you're able to question and you have that time and space to protest, it's a very important time to be able to find a way to connect with other people, to find actions you can take, careers you might get into that can lead to positive change. And even older people, many people that I've talked to are worried about their children and their grandchildren, because it is undeniable that we have wildfires and floods. So there is this very strange situation where every day is about denial and about just trying to survive and carry out, one's day, but at the same time, trying to stay in touch with making change.
Yeah, and I think also there's, at least from a Swedish perspective, we sometimes forget, if I can use we in this context, those kind of basic things that people are struggling with that you mentioned. And people have problems in the here and now in their everyday life, whether it's working 2 jobs. I guess there's some Swedes that do that out of necessity, but not as many as in the US. So I think that also how climate change was framed as a future problem. It was not like your own children, it was the grandchildren. And then that kind of shifted very fast when the kind of climate change became the here and now, at least on the news. But for people living their everyday life, unless the fire is outside of your house or where you're living, it's not going to be your everyday struggle in a sense. So I think that also it is a middle-class kind of take on things and not realizing that other people live other lives and have other things they're struggling with.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's easy to forget that sometimes living sustainably is a luxury, and having the choice or making sustainable choices is like, a luxury in itself. Not everyone has the ability to do that. Not everyone has the funds, and not everyone can just go and buy, a reusable shopping bag or a green car or a electric vehicle, or switch their power to something more renewable. And people who are kind of more privileged often forget, probably me included, that that's not something everyone actually can choose. And people working for oil refineries, like you were talking about before, they don't necessarily have a choice. And if they are constantly thinking about the impact of their work, that's kind of completely uprooting their life. Like if you're going to work every day knowing that you're actively destroying the planet, that I guess doesn't really create a very positive existence for you. So it's interesting.
It also leads to political division everywhere. right? Sweden certainly is included in that in terms of people feeling that the green transition threatens their jobs, and so they see a political party that might advocate for keeping their jobs, together with thinking that the workforce should be primarily people who are native to a certain country, rather than understanding that there's climate migration, that migration of many different kinds that involve change and ways of looking at things that also shift your perspective. So I think you're right that it's hard for us to understand and be in other people's shoes.
And that goes back also to what you said earlier during the other interview, and talking to people and actually meeting other people and their experiences, and through film or other ways also documenting that and putting it into other contexts. Because I think, at least with CEMUS and in education, we don't do that enough. And we also have a system where we invite guest lecturers. So it's around 200 guest lecturers in total for your academic year. And if we would look at the background of those people coming here, I mean, naturally most of them would be university teachers, researchers, but not enough of those 200 roughly are from other experiences or other perspectives in that sense that we're talking about right now. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's, I see that some of my most important experiences in the university have been when people outside of the margins have come to speak to my students, have come to speak to my classes when I was a student, whether they were international guests or whether they were advocates from organizations like unions or community organizations to talk about what concerns their communities. And, service learning has become a big thing in university. I don't know how that works in Sweden, but for us, field experience, getting out of your own bubble, having some practical experience in the world makes a big difference in thinking about what you really want to do and what you care about, as well as understanding other people's concerns. Mm.
Yeah, I think if I think to lectures that have stuck with me or that I still think about or find myself going back to, they're all from probably people who are not from an academic background, which is maybe not necessarily what all my professors want to hear. But we've had lectures, I remember one maybe in the course I just took from a man who works at Greenpeace in Sweden. And we had a lecture by him, or like a class kind of interactive thing by him one day. And then the next day we went to the climate strike in Stockholm and he was standing on stage. And I was like, oh, this is we went up and said hi and, had a chat and whatever. But it was a really kind of nice full circle. Yeah, we could see that he was almost very proud that we had all come as well. It was a nice moment. Mm.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, including in whether it's in courses or other conversation, also different activists and different types of activism, because I think that has also become maybe in media and the public debate that it is a stereotype of who is an activist and what kind of activities that kind of activism entails. So I think that is also important, which I don't know if we at CEMUS do enough of either. So
yeah. I feel like a lot of my friends and I talked about this kind of when we had that course from the guy from Greenpeace about the fact that you kind of feel like a fake activist if you're not like at the front of the protest holding a sign, which is, really, I guess it kind of deters people a lot. Like I remember going to my first climate protest and I was like, I'm not shouting loud enough. I'm not being angry enough. I'm not yelling enough, having all these thoughts, which is really interesting as someone who I guess is trying actively to get involved in these sorts of things. And I just imagine, I wonder what other people think. Like, is there this massive group of people who are just simply too scared or feel like they're kind of, it's like imposter syndrome, I think is the word. All these people are having imposter syndrome about, their type of activism when really doing something is always better than doing nothing. Mm.
I think that's what you brought up is really important. I think back to my kinds of activism, the activism I was attracted to, and then the kinds of agonizing thoughts that I had, that I know many people had, as, we're not doing enough. We're not having an impact. How do we become more aggressive? But sometimes it's also important, well, not sometimes, I think it's important to think about, how do we see society in general? This idea of, for one thing, acknowledging and appreciating people's emotions, where they're coming from, where people's lives have led them, rather than shouting at each other or feeling like you have to shout the loudest, or that maybe you have to do civil disobedience. There's a time and place for everything. But in trying to understand and build collective consciousness, to connect with people who don't think like you, who have more possibly at stake, that's a huge act of courage and commitment, and it's not easy to figure out how to do. And I think that that's, again, something that's I have always struggled with and worked on. Connections are very much networking, but also not networking just for personal gain, but in order to bring other people together for action, to build power, to find ways that people can work in coalitions with one another. I think as a young person particularly, you just really want to feel that you are reacting to what you think is right. And emotionally, the fear is hard to suppress. And again, peer pressure, and are you doing it the right way, all those things. So I hear what you're saying, and I really identify with it. And I think it's very important for the older generation, as well as educators, to think about ways to broaden the ways we can connect with one another.
And we also need more people and all sorts of people if we're going to get anything done. Maybe there are things being done, but I always hoped for more people and more things getting done. And I think also there's this thing about not celebrating enough and not getting too detailed into certain things that seems like things are not moving or things are not changing, and forgetting about the kind of mysteries of life, or just like how strange all of this is, and if you kind of zoom out from yourself. So I think that's also been kind of lacking in activism or in different kind of environmental movements over time. Maybe it was different in the 70s. It was before my time, but yeah.
No, we had the same problems, very similar problems. Because, we're all, most countries are dealing with inequality and separation of different sorts. And that keeps us from being able to reach out and build more mass movements, right? And then also, if, let's say, to give an example, in the Bay Area, in Northern California, there's been a struggle over, for example, whether to build a coal terminal in the harbor or to build up one that is already there. And different organizations get involved in these things. And for labor unions, it's really about jobs, right? So people get very angry with unions that are fighting for their jobs, or for future jobs in, say, developing another football stadium or baseball stadium instead of using the land for a more sustainable purpose. Then, of course, there's developers in the background who are also sometimes using unions or using workers and pushing them in the foreground to say, oh, it's about jobs. It's not really about how rich I'm going to get. So really thinking about how these complicated issues are happening and how we do get separated, it is, so for example, we are trying to learn more about what the building trades are dealing with. Myself, coming from, as an electrician, I was working with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And while I was a union leader, I shifted to calling it the International Brother and Sisterhood of Electrical Workers, but it's a hard sell. At any rate, at least we now call each other brothers and sisters and not just brothers. You can, if you're not in a construction job, if you're not in the building trades and you're a youth activist or you're a member of the community, it is really hard to understand, why construction unions might be so selfish. But finding ways to, say, support the campaigns for green schools, where there could be more jobs developed to retrofit schools, to weatherize them, to create renewable energy. Those are positive campaigns where you can create coalitions with building trades unions and other unions so that more jobs are created and there are alternatives to projects that don't provide sustainable environments for our communities.
Yeah, and that's very true also, that sustainability does not always have to be about building new things out of steel, concrete, and glass, which usually ends up being, it's about reusing things, and that could mean a lot of jobs as well. So I'm curious also now, because you've been on this European trip in Norway with previous contacts you had, and also kind of curious also what you are working on right now. What is the next project?
So I'm still involved with WAGE, work in a greening economy. This is a Norwegian-based research team, which we're doing together with Nigerian workers and Californian workers. And that's been a process of producing several publications, but also getting involved with interviewing many people, and then producing media. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about Talking Union, Talking Climate afterwards. But in addition to that, the organization WAGE is sort of morphing now into working closer with the environmental organization to use some of our videos to sensitize environmentalists about workers' views. And also sensitize workers about environmentalists' views and find ways that people can connect and where there could be a more positive industrial policy that does develop jobs that for people who might be displaced from their work, that doesn't only protect the industries that are there, but that develops new ways, whether it's recycling safely and with good jobs, good labor standards, or green steel, green batteries, or even protecting the rivers and conserving the forests. So this is a new area of work where we're using video, and the idea is to use what we call video elicitation, where we talk to people, and then we create a short video, and then we talk to, say, the first one would be environmentalists, and we talk to workers, and then we edit those together, and then show different groups, this amalgamation of voices, and then stimulate dialogue around that. So we're connecting people artificially, but also and virtually and in person, as a way to really foster dialogue and stimulate ways of making, a more collective effort, bringing people together to create change. That's one thing. I've also been involved with the Canadian Building Trades Unions. We have a research team called Climate Industry Research Team, and we're just concluding a climate literacy project where we've interviewed training directors and teachers and labor union officers and organizers in Europe, the United States, and in Canada about climate literacy and how they're preparing apprentices, but also people who've been in the field for a while, to understand how important their work is, how much it contributes to society, and then also together with the skills of working with the materials that are maybe new to them or maybe changed or maybe used in a different way. And also to promote cooperation among the trades, because even among the trades, there's a lot of competition and jurisdictional disputes. Who gets to put up the solar panels and who gets to dig the ditches? Is it laborers? Is it electricians? Is it operating engineers? All of these things really are part of climate literacy, is that we have to work collectively in order to make sure that what we call the performance gap, that we get the efficiency that we are striving for in the end. And it's something that we have kind of left behind in the past. So there are a lot of different projects that I've been involved in. Those are two that I can talk about.
All right, great to hear. I'm on my final question. Do you want to add something, Sophie? I think we covered a lot.
Yeah, I think I don't think I have anything more questions for the moment.
Yeah, and this is one of the questions where we kind of put at least some guests on the spot, but it's a song question. I mean, have you had a theme song in your life that kind of reappeared, or something you're playing now that you feel like this is the song the listener should put on after finishing listening to this?
I'm going to throw that over to Sophie.
No. I feel like we can both answer this one. Maybe we have different songs, or maybe they're the same.
Yeah,
who knows?
Let's do that.
I need to think though. Daniel even told me this question before, but he only said he would.
Yeah, but that's the wonders of editing. You can think for a while, and it's a hard question, and you don't want to answer with something embarrassing, of course.
I'll venture out on this, and I don't listen to music a whole lot, and so I'm really out of the loop. I appreciate it when people bring songs to my attention and music to my attention, and I'm very eclectic in my tastes. A friend of mine just took me to the opera, and it was actually not the opera; it was a student recital where people were singing from songs from Mozart and Puccini, but also from Iceland and Tchaikovsky. And one thing that it reminded me of is that how music is a terrific vehicle to express emotions. Even if you don't understand the words, it's extraordinary how it awakes something in your body. One of my favorite songs is "We Are the World." So it's, I guess, a good theme song for me.
I like it. I think maybe mine is a little less deep. It's probably going to be "Thank You for the Music." Yeah. I think it's just a joyous song. I think it's important to be thankful in our lives. And music meaning literal music, but then I guess also other forms of happiness or creativity that you find within your life. So for me, Daniel, maybe you should answer too.
Well, when we do our final podcast episode.
Oh, you're only going to reveal that?
Then I'm going to answer it.
The big reveal.
When we have the final.
I'll be listening in.
Was it you, Sophie, that suggested we should do a playlist?
Yes, I said we should make a Spotify playlist so that everyone can listen to the songs from the whole series.
We're getting there.
It's suggestions.
If you think too much on it or too long.
No, it doesn't count if you think enough.
So one last question is, should I say something about Talking Union, Talking Climate?
Well, the movie.
Yeah.
Well, if you want to, sure. I mean, and it's being screened. Of course, the listeners can't really zoom back in time and take part in it. But there's an event this afternoon at CEMUS, and that's also why you're here. But please, go ahead.
Yeah. This was a project that came out of the WAGE research team, which I directed, a short video, 15 minutes. And it's the first time that 3 oil workers were able to meet each other over Zoom. And it's a Californian, a Norwegian, and a Nigerian worker who get a chance to meet each other. And immediately they start talking about what hours they work, what shifts they work, and then move into talking about their work as unionists and what it's like to be a unionist and how their companies treat them and treat their union. And that's an important part of it because we often don't think about how critical labor standards are and what labor conditions are, and the freedom of association, the freedom to speak up, the freedom of collective bargaining as a vital part of any economy and building, jobs that are good, not just for one group of people, but for everybody. They go on to talk about climate change and how it's impacted their jobs, their industry, what they think should be done. Again, it's a very brief talk and very spontaneous. It's been edited down with some visual footage of their different workplaces and some of the things that they talk about. And hopefully it's a good way for people to understand more about what workers think and the impact of climate change in terms of different places in the world, the global north and the global south, but also more capitalist, market-oriented, more social democratic countries, and then countries that have been formally colonized and are also in development now. And that's a tall order for a very short video, but hopefully it's a great way for people to engage in a climate discussion as well as a labor activism discussion.
Great. And will it be released online as well?
So hopefully, yes, it will be.
So then we can add that to the notes to the episode and share that in social media. So thank you so much, Sophie and Vivian, for this conversation. I think this room worked better than my storage office studio that we have back at CEMUS. We actually have a table we can sit around. So thank you so much. And that's it for this episode. And we'll be coming back with more episodes with guests like this further down spring. So thank you so much. Thanks for today.
Thanks so much. Great questions, and it's really wonderful meeting both of you.
Thank you.